So hello and welcome to this Introduction to Culture Studies NPTEL course, where we're looking at Jan Hacking's The Social Construction of What. So we have already had one lecture on this particular text, and we'll move on to the other part of the text that we are covering. So like I said in the earlier lecture, the first lecture for this text, that we were looking at the introduction quite closely because that sort of delineates or maps out what this book aspires to do in terms of its thematic content, in terms of its arguments. So the social construction of what is, like I said in the earlier lecture, a warning, a caution against looking at social constructivism as the only analysis, as the only perspective to look at culture and cultural conditions, because that then becomes a bit of a grand narrative in its own right, and that also becomes quite reifying and quite reductionist and quite rarefied. Because it takes away the other complexities, the other complex conditions, the other complex components which inform the categories of culture and the different subcategories of culture. So, and in this particular book, does not decry social constructivism. It does not decry the social construction argument. It actually calls for a more complex social construction argument. So it sort of looks at, it basically critiques the social construction argument, which denies or disregards the other associated arguments. It either calls for a more complex understanding of culture, a more complex understanding of feminism, a more complex understanding of emotion from different perspectives, rather than from just a purely social construction perspective. So this is the long and short, the idea, the argument, the primary argument in this particular book. Okay, so and in the last lecture, the opening lecture for this book, Hacking talked about the so-called phenomenon, the Alan so-called phenomenon, which was basically a hoax idea, a hoax publication, a very sophisticated literary cultural journal called Social Text, where the physicist, New York physicist Alan Sokal, he just appropriated the jargon, the rhetoric of postmodernism, post-structuralism, and sent off a submission which was accepted in Social Text, which, like you said, is a very sophisticated journal. And that phenomenon, the so-called hoax, becomes quite vital according to Hacking over here, and it opens up the possibilities. It opens up some worse situations, some worse examples of people who are not even aware that they are what they're writing as a hoax, who are not even aware that what they're writing is bogus material. They send their submissions, they write articles discussing social events, cultural events, political events, using the same reifying rhetorical language, and that gets published. That becomes an industry in its own right. So social construction, this entire idea of social constructivism, becomes an academic industry and a dominant grand narrative inside academia. That is what Hacking is decrying over here as a philosopher. He calls for, he summons, he alerts us to a more complex analysis of culture, a more complex understanding of human life, of discourses, etc. Okay, so in this section that we will cover today, Hacking talks about relativism. So what is relativism? So relativism, obviously, as you know, is a very postmodern phenomenon, a very postmodern term in some sense. So you talk about relativism as moral relativism, cultural relativism, etc. Different kinds of relativism can be operated at different points of time, and that obviously means there is nothing absolute. There's nothing which is primary or authentic, or which is a given. Now that is a very post-structuralist, postmodernist argument, which we have seen in the various texts that we've covered so far. Now what Hacking is alerting us against, or warning us against, is not a move away from relativism. Definitely not. He is a philosopher in a very robust, sophisticated tradition, and he's the first one to put his hand up and say and acknowledge the beauties, the privileges of relativism, the privileges of social construction as an epistemic analysis. Now what he's warning us against is shallow relativism, is rarefied relativism, or reified relativism, where we sort of make the argument that everything is related to everything else. So in that analysis, in that kind of an epistemic argument, Hacking argues, and in a very short while we'll see that, he says anything goes, right? So that breaks down the walls between truth and non-truth, between torture and liberation, between oppression and articulation, because if you're making an argument that everything is relative, then you can justify torture, you can justify oppression, you can justify abuse, you can justify all kinds of horrible, hideous human activities. And that is, again, the pragmatic argument that hacking is making. So he's saying that relativism can be a danger if we simplify it, if we use it in a very simplified reductionist manner. Okay, and they realize the danger, they realize the risk of relativism, as hacking would go on to delineate now. Okay, so this is on the screen, the last bit on the page on the screen, where hacking says, for many people, so-called epitomize what are now called the science wars. The science wars can be focused on social construction. One person argues, this is page 4 on your screen, one person argues that scientific results, even in fundamental physics, are social constructs. An opponent, angered, protests that the results are usually discoveries about our world that hold independently of society. People also talk about the culture wars, which often hinge on issues of race, gender, colonialism, or a shared canon of history and literature that children should master, and so on. These conflicts are serious. They invite heartfelt emotions. Nevertheless, I doubt that the term culture wars, science wars, and now Freud wars would have caught on if they did not suggest gladiatorial sport. It is a bemused spectator who talk about the wars. So, it has a voyeuristic quality. It has a spectator-like quality, these wars, and these are eventually ineffective. Culture wars, science wars, the war within sciences, the war within culture and science, where this argument that science through the social construct, mathematics through the social construct. Well, it's definitely a social construct at a human level. It's constructed by human beings at different historical points of time, etc. So in that sense, it's definitely a historical social construct. But to look at mathematics or science or physics as purely social constructs, and that becomes a dogmatic analysis. That becomes a dogmatic discourse. So it's a very thin line between dogma and discourse that we are treading away, and hacking is alerting us of that particular line. There is, alas, a great deal of anger out there that no amount of lightheartedness would dispel. Many more things are at work in these wars that I can possibly touch on. One of them is a great fear of relativism. What is this wicked troll? Clear sentiments, clear statements about it are hard to find. Commonly, people suspected of relativism insist that they are not haunted by it. A few, such as the Edinburgh sociologists of science Barry Bonas and David Bloor, Paul Feyerabend of Anything Goes fame, managed to describe some 13 versions of relativism, but this attempt at divide and rule convinced no one. I think we should be less highbrow than these authors. Let us get down to gut reactions. What are we afraid of? Plenty. There is a notion that any opinion is as good as any other. If so, won't relativism license anything at all? Feminists have recently cautioned us about the dangers of this kind of relativism, for it seems to leave no ground for criticizing oppressive ideas. The matter may seem especially pressing for third world feminists. Now, feminism keeps coming up in Hacking's arguments, and he's making a very strong case over here, a very interesting case. And he's essentially saying that relativism, if pushed too far, if you say everything is relative, if you say that an entire discursive analysis should hinge on relativism, then the danger is that you can actually justify everything with relativism. You can actually talk about everything as a social construct, everything as a relative social construct, and in that sense, that can cause great dangers to a movement like feminism, right? So he's giving references over here, that relativism can license anything at all. It can license torture, it can license oppression, it can license the worst form of patriarchal oppression, the worst form of patriarchal repression. That too can be seen as a social construct, and therein, and in the process can be given some currency, can be given some legitimacy, through a very relativistic understanding of culture. So feminists have recently cautioned us about the dangers of this kind of relativism, for it seems to leave no ground for criticizing oppressive ideas, because oppressive ideas can be seen as social constructs which are relative to some of the constructs, and hence they should not be considered to be oppressive. They should not be considered to be repressive. They should be seen as texts, social constructs which can be analyzed and not critiqued. So that becomes a problem. That becomes a real problem. And what Hacking constantly tells us throughout this book is the fact that social construction can often operate in a purely reified academic space with very little connection, very little engagement with the daily lived reality of life. Okay, and therein lies the problem. Therein lies the sometimes shallowness of the social constructivist argument, and Hacking is alerting us to that shallowness, to that sort of disconnected condition, especially when it comes to cultural conditions. Okay. Then there is historical revisionism. The next stage is a notorious series of Holocaust denials. Might be a book entitled "The Social Construction of the Holocaust," a work urging that a Nazi extermination camps are exaggerated and a gas chamber is fiction. No one wants a relativism that tells us that such a book will, insofar as concerns truth, be on a par with all the others. So he's giving extreme examples over here. He's saying, now if we take relativism too far, if we look at social construction too far, and the entire idea of everything is social constructed, if it push it too far, if you look at relativism too far, so there might be a book which might argue, which might be an apology, might be a justification of Nazi torture of Jews. They might deny the Holocaust at all, and there have been attempts for Holocaust denials, which is illegal, by the way, in several parts of Europe for real historical reasons. Now he's saying that if we allow this relativism to operate freely, to be a complete free market of ideas, an open market of ideas, so very soon there's a possibility that there might be a book entitled "The Social Construction of the Holocaust," which can be a book about Holocaust denial. It can be a book urging that the Nazis were not bad at all, that they were historically not really oppressors of Jews, but they were something else, etc. So in that sense, again, that goes back to the argument just a while ago, where Hacking said that in that sense it would be impossible to critique any form of oppression if we are essentially looking at everything as a social construct, everything as a relativistic social construct. Okay, right. So my own view is that we do not need to discuss such issues under the heading of revisionism. The question of historical revisionism is a question of how to write history. Make plain the relativist sociologists of this tribe, Barnes and Blow make plain that the relativist sociologists of this tribe are obliged to sort out beliefs and relations and actions using a critical version of the standards of their own culture. Fairbairn's last words were that every culture is one culture and we ought to take a stand against oppression anywhere. Okay, so Fairbairn, who is credited with the word "anything goes," the phrase "anything goes," which is sometimes used in a very derogatory sense. When we talk about postmodernism, that anything goes in postmodernism, that everything is relative to everything else. So there's nothing called oppression, nothing called liberation. What is oppression to one is liberation to other, etc. But Fairbairn, Hacking quotes Fairbairn and say that his last words were oppression is oppression, and so it is wrong, it is incorrect, it is an error, an epistemic error, and also a human judgmental error if we look at oppression as some kind of a social construct which can be validated, which can be licensed using a relativistic argument. Okay, and I ended my own contribution to a book on rationality and relativism by quoting Zoppo-Sartre's last words, explaining why the Jewish and Islamic traditions played no part in his thoughts. They did not, for the simple reason that they were no part of his life. So again, we're looking at someone's lived life as being a real phenomenon and not just a social phenomenon. So over here, Hacking is referring to a preface, an appendage that he wrote on rationality and relativism, where he alluded or referred to Zoppo-Sartre and quite clearly stated that Sartre's ideas had no influences whatsoever from the Jewish or Islamic tradition, simply because he did not live those traditions, right? So in that sense, social construction becomes secondary to lived reality. And lived reality informs intellectual currents far more prominently, far more immediately, far more organically than any rarefied idea of social construction. Okay, there are more global bourgeoismen. Intellectuals and nationalists are frightened of religious fundamentalism in India, Israel, the Islamic world, the United States. Does not relativism entail that any kind of religious fundamentalism is as good as any kind of science? So again, he's giving an extreme example. He's saying that it is possible, if you push the relativism argument too far, to argue that religious fundamentalism is as valid as science, is as licensed as science, right? It can't question fundamentalism, it can't question abuse, it can't question mass torture, it can't question mass perception, simply because you are looking at those categories too as social constructs, and you're giving sophistication, an epistemic sophistication. You're conferring an epistemic sophistication on those categories from a social constructivist perspective, and again, the cultural relativism perspective. So in that sense, you can't really classify anything as oppression, you can't really classify anything as torture or abuse. Okay, and then he ends his section by saying This is the final paragraph before the next section. Relativism and decline are real worries, but I'm not going to address them directly. It is good to stay away from them, for I cannot expect successfully to dispel or solve problems where so many wise heads have written so many wise words without effect. More generally, I avoid speculating further on the profound malaise that fuels today's culture wars. I am most an unhappy witness to it, saddened by what it does. So the entire idea of culture wars is something which becomes a real problem, a real lived problem according to hacking. And he's saying that this is a problem that we need to address, but I'm not going to engage with that directly because it's a major problem and it's beyond the scope of this particular book. Okay. And then he goes on to the next section where he says quite directly, social construction talk has recently been all the rage. It's a trendy thing, it's a trendy term at the moment. I cannot hope to do justice to all parties. I shall take most of them examples from authors who put social construction up front in the titles. They may not be the clearest, most sensible, or the most profound contributors, but at any rate they are self-declared. So what are social constructions and what is social constructionism? With so many inflamed passions going the rounds, you might think that we first want a definition to clear the air. On the contrary, we first need to confront the point of social construction analysis. Don't ask for the meaning, ask what's the point. So again, we're back to the pragmatic argument, the utilitarian argument, so the functional argument. So hacking is saying quite clearly over here, before we define what social construction is, or the entire idea of social constructionism, the more immediate question ought to be, what is the point of social construction? So what is the purpose that social construction analysis serves in terms of understanding of culture, in terms of understanding as text, in terms of understanding of real phenomenon, political or otherwise. Okay, this is not an unusual situation. There are many words or phrases of which the same thing must be said. Take exploitation. In a recent book about it, Alan Wertheimer does a splendid job of seeking out necessary and sufficient conditions for the truth of statements of the form A exploits B. So exploitation becomes, again, a very important category in hacking's analysis. So, and he mentions Wertheimer and his book on exploitation. He does not quite succeed because the point of saying that middle-class couples exploit surrogate mothers or that colleges exploit the basketball stars and scholarships, Wertheimer's prize examples is to raise consciousness. The point is less to describe the relation between colleges and stars than to change how we see those relations. This relies not on necessary and sufficient conditions for claims about exploitation, but on fruitful analogies and new perspectives. In the same way, a primary use of social construction has been for raising consciousness. This is done in two distinct ways, one overarching, the other more localized. First, it is urged that a great deal or all of a lived experience and the world we inhabit is to be conceived of as socially constructed. Then there are local claims about the social construction of a specific X. The X may be authorship Zulu nationalism. A local claim may be suggested by an overarching attitude, but the point of the local claim is to raise consciousness about something in particular. Local claims are in principle independent of each other. You might be a social constructionist about brotherhood or fraternity, but maintain that youth homelessness is real enough. Most of this book is about local claims. That is why I began with the question, the social construction of what? And open with a list of whats. The items in my alphabetical list are so various. Danger is a different sort of thing from reality, or women refugees. What unites many of the claims is an underlying aim to raise consciousness. Now, what hacking exposes over here is a very selectionist way in which social construction works. So when it comes to quote-unquote real situations, then there's a different kind of perspective which is taken. But when it comes to a condition from which you can distance yourself epistemically or in terms of lived reality, and then you can have the luxury of social construction, which then becomes a luxury, which then becomes a mode of analysis, which is used to raise consciousness. Okay, and it gives us an idea where between a local claim and a macro claim, that's right, a bigger reality and a local reality. So, and he says over here, you might be a social constructionist about brotherhood and fraternity, but maintain that youth homelessness is real enough. So, he creates a structure over here. He's saying essentially that social construction and reality can often go in opposite directions. So you can be a social constructionist when it comes to certain issues such as brotherhood or fraternity or something related to gender. But then, when it comes to youth homelessness or youth joblessness, then you can talk about that as, a reality. So again, there's a degree of pseudo-reality about social constructionism that hacking is maintaining. So the entire idea of social construction or being a social constructionist can often generate a pseudo-reality which can take you away from the lived reality of experience, right? So therein lies the danger, therein lies the problem that hacking is detonating. Okay, so, and then he moves on to say, talk about how social construction works. One of the ways in which social construction works, according to hacking, is to raise a clarion call against inevitability. And this is the section that is on your screen and should be appearing on the screen at the moment. Social construction work is critical of the status quo. Social construction about X tends to hold that 1. X need not have existed or need not be at all as it is. X or X as it is at present is not determined by the nature of things. It is not inevitable. So the inevitability argument is something which is a characteristic of most social constructionist theories, and hacking says away that one of the ways in which these theories branch out or flesh out into bigger theories is by assuming that X need not have existed. X doesn't exist except as a social construct. X is not determined by nature of things. It is not inevitable. Right? And one of the problems with this argument is that you can sometimes take away the reality of X by saying it is not inevitable, by saying it doesn't exist, by saying it's not natural, by saying it is completely engineered socially. You take away the reality, you take away the experientiality from X as a category, and therein lies a problem that hacking is highlighting. Very often they go further and urge that, number 2, X is quite bad as it is. And number 3, we'd be much better off if X were done away with, or at least radically transformed. So, suppose you replace X with patriarchy, or X with female violence in women. Now, if we are to say that violence in women doesn't exist except as a social construction, it doesn't exist except as something which can be analyzed socially, then obviously you're doing a great disservice, a massive disservice to the human sufferers of that kind of abuse, the human sufferers of that kind of violence, right? And very often you connect it by saying it is quite bad as it is. We'd be much better off if X were done away with, or at least radically transformed. So again, if you look at the rhetoric that is being used over here, it's very rhetorical, it's very jargon heavy, it's very epistemic. It's strictly epistemic, it's strictly constructivist in quality, and that does a disservice to a great extent to the lived reality of the experience, right? And therein lies a problem that hacking is constantly emphasizing: the lived reality as against the discursive understanding of that particular condition. Okay. A thesis of type 1 is a starting point. So type 1 obviously is the claim that X did not have existed, does not exist, not natural, not inevitable, etc. So that is the analysis, that is the first thesis that is being urged, that is being stated over here. Our thesis of type 1 is a starting point. The existence or character of X is not determined by the nature of things. X is not inevitable. X was brought into existence or shaped by social events, forces, history, all of which could well have been different. Many social construction theses at once advance to 2 and 3, but they need not do so. One may realize that something which seems inevitable in the present state of things was not inevitable, and yet it is not thereby a bad thing. But most people use social construction idea enthusiastically want to criticize, change, or destroy some X that it is like in the established order of things. Now, this bit is very important. And what hacking is doing over here is bringing the idea of bringing in the quotient of prejudice. So there's a prejudice which is often operative in social constructionist theory. So if you don't like X, if you don't like X as a phenomenon, you first say it doesn't exist naturally, it's a socially engineered phenomenon, and then you move on very quickly to the axiomatic attachment and say that this is a bad thing, it should be done away with, etc. That is obviously a reductionist thing. Now, if X, suppose we have a phenomenon, a very complex phenomenon such as suppose football fandom, right? Now, football fandom can be a discursive phenomenon. Football fandom can be a real experience. Football fandom can be, completely social engineered situation according to social constructionist theory. Now, if you say football fandom is a purely socially engineered condition, that obviously is reductionist, because that takes away some of the other factors which come into being, such as emotions, affect, biology, different kinds of affective associations, which may not be purely social. And quality is an entanglement of the inside and the outside, between the interior and the exterior, right? So that's problem one. Problem two is, if you don't like, it's very easy. One of the conditions, one of the markers, one of the hallmarks of social constructionist theory is that to immediately brand the phenomenon as negative. It's to brand the phenomenon as something which is appalling and evil, can be done away with, etc. Now, again, by wishing that it's evil, by saying it's evil, by making a claim that it should be done away with, it doesn't really affect the real human engagement with that phenomenon. Now, it's a very complex phenomenon. I'm using the example of football fandom as just one random example, but you can think of other examples as well. Now, there's a degree of prejudice which comes in social constructionist theory, and more often than not, social constructionist theory, it comes to a series of negative understanding of a particular event. If it doesn't like it, there's a degree of prejudice, a degree of hypercriticality about that particular analysis, and that hypercriticality, that prejudice, can often become a reductionist way of understanding the phenomenon, because you're not really looking at it as a complex phenomenon. You're looking at it from a prejudiced perspective. You don't like the phenomenon, and you wish it were done away with. You wish that it did not exist at all. And that wish, that prejudice, that presupposition makes you a prejudice examiner of that phenomenon, a prejudice student, a prejudice person in terms of understanding or engaging with that phenomenon, right? So that prejudice quotient is something that Hacking is highlighting over here. And he's saying that most people use the social construction idea enthusiastically, want to criticize, change, or destroy some X that they dislike in the established order of things. So again, it's very easy to be seduced by the social constructionist idea of anti-establishment, saying anything which is established, anything which is status quo is necessarily bad, and hence must be done away with, must be questioned, etc. Now, that kind of understanding is a very narrow understanding of the phenomenon according to Hacking, and that does a lot of disservice to the real lived experience of that particular phenomenon, which affects lots of people in a real space. Okay, so I'll stop at this point in this lecture, but just to sum up before we move on to the next section, which is gender, what Hacking is warning us against is not the privileges of social constructionist theory. He's very aware, and he acknowledges, and he admits, and he is a fan of the privileges to a certain extent. He's obviously aware and obviously assertive of the fact that historical phenomena are social constructs, are socially conditioned to a great extent, and that conditioning takes into account economy, language, religion, politics, and a whole host of other factors and components. However, it's a very complex phenomenon, and to look at those phenomena just from a constructionist perspective, just as a negative perspective, just from a perspective of criticality, can often do a disservice to the complexity of the phenomena, to the human affective associations with that phenomena, to the human suffering of that phenomena. And if you couple that with moral relativism, cultural relativism, it makes it even worse, because then you can justify everything as a social text. You can justify everything as a socially engineered process, which then makes it almost impossible to criticize a real human suffering, to criticize historical examples of human abuse and torture and all kinds of oppression. So in that sense, social constructionist theory can be limiting, can be reductionist, and more importantly, towards the end, as you can see, it can be prejudicial in quality. Right? So I stop at this point in this lecture today, and I continue with the next lecture with this text. Thank you for your attention.